Alright, Ryan Bain here, showing how to clean top anchors. At most sport crags, there will be two bolts in place of these guys. We're going to use these as fixed anchors, these silver carabiners. So normally the bolts would have quick draws connected to them with gates opposite and opposed. Problem with this setup is it does not self-equalize, so you can always end up on one anchor and you potentially stand taking a little bit of a fall and ripping out the other anchor. This is generally what you'll see at most sport crags at the top. But for this demonstration, I'm going to hook up the 4-bar self-equalizing anchor. Make my life a little easier. So let's get it up here, and that way I don't need any other equipment other than one extra locking carabiner to clean this. So say we're at the top of the sport climb, and I just had my buddy pull all of the slack out of the system because I'm at the very top. Well, I have a couple of options on how I can get down from this climb. They all involve me clipping into this master point here with this extra carabiner. The first option is I can be lowered down by threading these, the rope through these two top locking carabiners, or we're going to say our rappel rings in this instance, and then be lowered down to the ground, having our belayer lower us, or we can double rope rappel. So essentially I'm going to get up to the point where we can decide on which method we're going to use. Usually you want to have this taken care of on the ground, so these are both, your belayer and yourself are both aware of what's going on. Alright, so essentially when I climb to the top, I call take, my belayer takes me in, and now I can either use a couple of things. Personal anchor systems. Just make sure they're redundant. Don't just use one personal anchor because you could potentially fall and hurt yourself. Always stick to redundancy. You want to use 2 points. In my setup, I generally have 2 daisy chains girth hitched through the leg loops and one through the belay loop, and then that way I can connect one to either side of the anchors. But for this, like I said, all we need is an extra carabiner. So I'm going to take my extra carabiner, since I'm on take, hook it through my belay loop, and I do through the rope just because it's an extra full strength. Not for now. We're going to clip through 3 of these 4 bars. The reason for that is if one side breaks, we can slide all the way to the other end and we're not going to come off just because of the fact that we're looped in here. Alright, so now make sure your lockers are locked. You know, these ones don't necessarily need to be locked since they're on the anchors, but I like to be safe. So now that I am sitting on the anchors, I can tell that the rope has no slack, or has slack to it. So I can yell down to my belayer to give me slack. And what I'm going to do is essentially pull 5, 6, maybe 8 feet of slack out. So that way I can tie myself a knot on a bite. An overhand figure 8 will work anything. Then what we can do is I brought an extra carabiner. If you had just followed your buddy up, you can use a draw. Clip the rope to your harness, because we're going to untie ourselves from it, and we don't want to be stranded at the top. So this is a safety leash for the rope. So essentially now that I'm on the anchor, I'm hanging from it. My buddy's sitting down there twiddling his thumbs. He knows that I'm going to be lowered this time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to unthread this rope from my harness, being careful not to drop it, even though I have my safety. So we get this out here, untie all of your knots. Then you feed through the rappel rings, and I pull all the slack out until my knot catches again. And what I do is we're going to take a figure 8, retrace figure 8, and we thread it back through our harness the same way we would if we were tying it at the bottom. Make sure you're tied off correctly. Double check everything before you eliminate one system from, double check everything before you eliminate your connection to one system. So essentially, before I untied, I realized that I was locked in and set on this system. Now, I can undo this locking carabiner since I'm tied back in. I double checked my knot, make sure it's tight. I can undo the figure or the overhand on a bite, and we're going to allow all the slack to fall down on the belayer side. So now we can undo the locking biner here and have our belayer take in slack. So now, as the belayer's got slack in, I can get off of this point. So what we do is we double check everything, make sure we're hooked up, and you can disconnect yourself from the anchors. And generally you want to clip these to your harness so they don't get in your way when you're rappelling or being lowered down. And now my buddy can lower me to the ground. Okay. And in order to keep this a bit shorter, I'm just going to assume that we already made it back up to the top here. Let me untie and get this anchor set up again. Alright, so retrace figure 8. Like I said, double check everything. Redundancy is key in climbing, especially if you want to live a long time. Figure 8 is tied. Okay. Now, let's assume that our climbing partner is intelligent and is using the same setup here. So they stuck the 4-bar anchor up at the top for us. Locked in. I'm climbing up. Everything's locked in. And I made it to the top. So I yell take. I have my partner take me. So now I'm hanging off the rope again. Going, okay, here, what do we need to do? So I take my locking carabiner. Once again, I clip through 3 of the 4. So now I am hanging solely on the anchor. I still have the second system set up. I can yell at my belayer to give me slack. Again, I do 5 to 6, maybe 8 feet to give yourself some room to work. Overhand on a bite. This again is your safety line. You don't want to drop the rope once you untie it from yourself and your partner has gone off belay. Otherwise somebody's going to have to climb up and rescue you. So clip the loop to my, clip the bite to my loop. Alright, so now I can undo the rope from the master point. Or sorry, I don't want to undo the rope from the master point. I want to undo the rope from myself first. After I've double checked everything is locked, made sure I'm sitting in the anchors. Okay, so now if I drop the rope, oh no! Thank God I had this loop attached to me, so I can pull it back up. And we feed it back through the belay rings the same way we did before. Except for in this instance, once you get it through, you want to tie a stopper knot so that it doesn't go through the anchor point up there. If we were to unclip this, the rope weight might drag this guy up and stop it. That's why we tie the stopper knot, so that way you're not stranded as well. Alright, so once I get the stopper knot threaded and once I get threaded through the belay rings, the stopper knot set up, I can pull all the slack out until I'm attached at my belt loop. We want to unclip this loop and make sure we tell our partner belay off. That way, now we can untie this loop and pull slack. And we make sure our partner said belay off, so he replied belay off. So now I can pull as much slack as I want through the system. And it will also make it easier if we undo the rope from the master point. That way you're not getting weird drag, as you can see here. Okay, so I'm pulling my slack. Now we're going to assume this is the midpoint. Since this is a short piece of rope, I don't have it marked. My belayer has told me that my rope is on the ground. I noticed the midpoint's right in the middle in between the anchors here. So I'm pretty set as far as the rappel goes. You always want to make sure that your rope is on the ground. It's wise to tie knots in the end, especially when you're being lowered, because you don't want to have your belayer lower you off the end of the rope. So in this instance, if my belayer was down here, we would have a knot tied in this end. So that way, when their belay device came to here, it would stop me from being lowered off the end. Same thing goes for rappel. If you're on a multi-pitch rappel, you might not have enough rope to get to the next rappel station. So instead of lowering off the ends, it's wiser to tie knots in the ends. Anyway, back to the rappel. So now that I'm set up on the anchor point, I'm loaded up, everything was locked. I have both strands of the rope coming through the anchors. I can grab my belay device and I clip that underneath the master point. This will make it a lot easier to unload the line and get everything out of your way. Now we're going to take 2 bites, feed it through the belay device like we're doing a 2-lined rappel. Make sure you're through the safety cable and your locking beaner is locked. Now we can test that we are on this system as well. So what I like to do is take a little weight out, hang on the rope, and give myself slack. Now I'm hanging on the anchor point. So I know that both systems are set, they're looking good, they're through there. So now, before we take ourselves off the other anchor point, you can have several things happen here. If your belayer's standing at the bottom, not playing with dogs, talking to people on that cliff, etc., they can provide a fireman's belay. So once I decide I'm going to get off of these anchors, I can step up a little bit, have my partner give me a fireman belay, so now I'm hanging on the rope. Or, the other thing I can do is I can tie an auto block for my leg loop to the line here. So that way if I go hands free, it doesn't drop me to the ground. Unfortunately I didn't bring my auto block. So we're going to assume that I'm getting a fireman belay so I can unload the system using the purple lines. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to do here, since I know I'm on belay, my buddy's fireman and me, I can unclip the master points from the bolts at the top of the route. And since my buddy's fireman and me, I know I'm on belay, I can see it visually working. Once I'm done, I can grab the brake strands, have the buddy let off on fireman's rappel, and down to the ground I go. And that is how you clean a sport route top anchor.